August 1943. Hauptmann Franz Stigler climbs from the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 and removes his flight gloves. His hands are still trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. In the 30 minutes he spent over the Reich, he encountered not 3 or 4 American bombers, but wave after wave of them, flying fortresses stretching to the horizon in formations so tight they looked like cities in the sky. He shot down one, maybe damaged another, but there were always more. Always. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. His crew chief approaches with a report. Tomorrow's fuel allocation has been cut again. They'll fly fewer sorties, fewer training hours for the new pilots. Stigler asks the obvious question: why are we running out of fuel when the Americans seem to have fuel to burn, enough to send hundreds of bombers over Germany every single day? The crew chief shrugs. He doesn't have an answer. Nobody does. But in the intelligence officer's tent there's a folder. Inside that folder are numbers that seem so impossible, so detached from reality, that experienced Luftwaffe officers dismiss them as propaganda. American aircraft production in 1943, approximately 85,000 aircraft. That's not a misprint. 85,000 in 1 year. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For comparison, Germany produced roughly 25,000 aircraft that same year. The ratio was more than 3 to 1, and it was getting worse. But here's what makes this story remarkable. German pilots didn't just doubt these numbers. They refused to believe them. They couldn't believe them. And that disbelief, that failure to comprehend the industrial might of America, would help seal the fate of the Third Reich. This is the story of what happened when German pilots looked up and saw not just American aircraft, but the visible proof of an industrial system they had been told couldn't exist. A story of how propaganda, ideology, and willful blindness prevented an entire military from understanding the enemy they faced until it was far too late. To understand how German pilots reacted to America's staggering aircraft production, we need to go back to where their disbelief began. Not in the skies over Germany, but in the classrooms and briefing rooms where Luftwaffe pilots learned about their enemy. In early 1942, before America had fully mobilized, German intelligence prepared assessments of American industrial capacity. These reports landed on the desks of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, General Hans Jeschonek, and other Luftwaffe leadership. The numbers they contained should have been alarming. Instead, they were dismissed. The reasoning was simple. Germany had been preparing for war since Adolf Hitler took power in 1933. The Luftwaffe had been secretly rebuilt in violation of the Versailles Treaty. German industry had been reorganized for military production. Training programs had been running for years. Meanwhile, America in 1941 had an army smaller than Portugal's. Its Air Corps operated obsolete aircraft. Its pilots trained in fabric-covered biplanes. How could such a nation, isolated by 2 oceans, suddenly transform into an industrial colossus? Ideology reinforced this skepticism. Nazi propaganda taught that Americans were a mongrel race, weakened by democracy and capitalism, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice that total war demanded. This wasn't just propaganda for the masses. Senior Luftwaffe officers genuinely believed it. Göring himself told his pilots that American aircraft were inferior, their crews poorly trained, their industrial system chaotic and inefficient. There was also a mathematical problem. Producing aircraft wasn't like stamping out rifles. Each bomber required thousands of skilled man-hours, precision aluminum work, advanced engines, complex instruments. German aircraft factories employed master craftsmen who had spent years learning their trade. Where would America find such workers? How would they train them? The Luftwaffe's own experience suggested it was impossible. So when American intelligence reports in 1942 began circulating figures of planned production, 60,000 aircraft that year, 125,000 the next, German analysts applied what seemed like common sense. They divided these figures by 10, by 20, Assuming the Americans were inflating numbers for propaganda purposes, the adjusted figures seemed reasonable, believable, and completely wrong. The first American bombing raid on Germany came in January 1943. 8th Air Force MB-17 Flying Fortresses struck targets in Wilhelmshaven. The raid involved just 64 bombers. Luftwaffe fighters intercepted them easily. 3 bombers were shot down, several others damaged. German pilots returned to base, confident in their superiority. But then came February. Then March, each month. More American bombers appeared. The raids grew larger. By summer 1943, American formations numbered in the hundreds. Luftwaffe pilots who had confidently intercepted dozens of bombers now faced formations so massive that shooting down 5 or 6 made no visible difference. It was like trying to stop an avalanche by throwing stones. Lieutenant Walter Schuck flew missions throughout 1943. Years later, he would recall his growing unease. At first, we thought we were winning. We shot them down by the dozens. But they kept coming. More bombers, more fighters, better tactics. And I began to wonder, where are all these aircraft coming from? How can they replace their losses so quickly? His squadron commander had no answer. Or rather, he had the official answer. American production figures were exaggerated. What they were seeing represented the temporary surge of an economy cannibalizing its civilian sector. Soon, the Americans would run out of aluminum, of skilled workers, of engines. Soon the tide would turn. It never did. By August 1943, reality was becoming impossible to deny. On the 17th, American bombers struck deep into Germany. 230 B-17s attacked the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, while another 146 hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. The Luftwaffe threw everything available at them. 300 fighters. They shot down 60 American bombers, a devastating loss rate of 20%. German pilots landed exhausted, low on ammunition, many with damaged aircraft. They had won a tactical victory. Schweinfurt's production was disrupted. The Americans had paid dearly, but as intelligence officers debriefed the pilots, a troubling pattern emerged. For every bomber shot down, 20 more had reached their targets, and preliminary reports indicated the Americans were already preparing replacements. Major Gunther Rohl, already an ace with over 100 victories, sat in the debriefing room that night and did the mathematics in his head. If we shoot down 60 bombers and they send 300 tomorrow, have we won or lost? If they can replace 60 aircraft in a week while we take a month to repair our damaged fighters, who is winning this war? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The intelligence reports kept coming. September brought updated American production estimates, 70,000 aircraft for 1943, possibly more. German staff officers examined the figures, checked them against observed raid strengths, against captured documents, against every source they could find. The numbers kept confirming themselves. Major Hajo Hermann, who would later develop innovative night-fighting tactics, reviewed these reports with a growing sense of dread. The Americans aren't just building more aircraft than us, he realized. They're building them faster, better, and in types we never even considered. Transports, trainers, liaison aircraft. For every combat aircraft we see, there are 2 more supporting it. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about systems. The Americans weren't simply building aircraft, they were building an entire industrial ecosystem. Factories to produce aluminum, refineries to produce aviation gasoline, training schools to produce pilots, maintenance depots to keep everything running. It was integration on a scale Germany had never attempted. And it showed. By late 1943, American bomber crews were logging more training hours than German fighter pilots. American mechanics had better tools, more spare parts, superior logistics. American squadrons could maintain higher operational rates because their supply chains worked. The contrast with German operations was stark. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran fighter pilot, saw this disparity firsthand. Our pilots are exhausted, He reported to his superiors, "We fly 3, 4, sometimes 5 missions a day. The Americans rotate their crews. Their pilots are fresh. Their aircraft are maintained. We're cannibalizing parts from damaged fighters to keep others flying. They're receiving new aircraft from the factory faster than we can shoot them down." The response from higher command was predictable. Fight harder. Be more aggressive. Trust in German superiority. The Führer has promised new weapons that will change the war, but promises couldn't change mathematics. The October 14th raid on Schweinfurt drove that point home brutally. 291 American bombers attacked. The Luftwaffe shot down 77, another tactical victory, but it cost them 38 fighters and, more critically, 28 experienced pilots. Luftwaffe fighter strength in the West was roughly 400 aircraft. Losing 38 in one day was unsustainable. And the Americans, they simply sent more bombers the next week. Those 77 losses represented 1 week of American production. 1 week. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke wrote in his diary, "I've shot down more than 30 American aircraft. I'm an ace several times over. But what does it matter? For every one I destroy, 10 more take its place. We're not fighting pilots anymore. We're fighting a production line." His words captured the growing despair in fighter squadrons across Germany. Individual skill, combat experience, tactical brilliance, none of it mattered when the enemy could simply overwhelm you with numbers. By December 1943, the truth was unavoidable. Intelligence officers compiled final production estimates for the year. The Americans had built approximately 85,000 military aircraft. 85,000. The number appeared in reports throughout the Luftwaffe command structure, and still many officers refused to believe it. General Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters, was one of the few who accepted reality. He presented his analysis to Goering in early 1944. "The numbers are accurate, Reichsmarschall. We've verified them through multiple sources. American production exceeds our own by a factor of 3, and it's accelerating." Goering's response was explosive. "Impossible. You're telling me these Americans, these shopkeepers and farmers, are building 3 times as many aircraft as the German Reich? That's Allied propaganda." "Our intelligence has been compromised," Galland tried to explain. He showed Goering the evidence. Reconnaissance, photographs of American aircraft factories, documents captured from downed bombers showing serial numbers in sequences that revealed production rates, pilot reports of new aircraft types appearing in combat. Nothing worked. The Reichsmarschall dismissed it all. He accused Galland of defeatism, of believing enemy propaganda, of lacking faith in German technical superiority. The meeting ended with Goering ordering his intelligence staff to revise their figures downward. Reality, he insisted, could not be as they described. But reality didn't care what Goering believed. In factory after factory across Germany, workers struggled with shortages. Aluminum was scarce. Skilled labor was conscripted into the army. Allied bombing disrupted production. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the arsenal of democracy was just hitting its stride. At Boeing's Seattle plant, workers assembled B-17 flying fortresses at a rate that would have seemed impossible in 1941. 1 bomber every few hours. At Willow Run, Henry Ford's massive facility in Michigan, B-24 Liberators rolled off the assembly line with similar regularity. At Lockheed, Republic, North American, Douglas, Grumman, and dozens of other manufacturers, the same story repeated. What made this possible wasn't magic. It was methodology. American engineers had broken aircraft production down into standardized processes. Instead of requiring master craftsmen, they trained workers to perform specific tasks. A housewife who'd never touched an aircraft before could learn to rivet panels in a week. A farmer could install hydraulic systems with 2 weeks of training. The assembly line, perfected by Henry Ford for automobiles, had been adapted for aircraft. German intelligence officers who studied American methods couldn't reconcile what they saw with their own experience. Their reports described factory workers many of them women, performing tasks that in Germany required years of apprenticeship. They described standardization so complete that wings built in California fit fuselages built in New York without modification. They described a system that seemed to violate every principle of aircraft manufacturing they knew. And yet it worked. By early 1944, American production was approaching 100,000 aircraft annually. German production, despite Albert Speer's reforms, would peak at around 40,000. The gap was widening, not closing. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots continued to worsen. They were flying more missions with less fuel, receiving fewer replacement aircraft, while facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger every week. Lieutenant Herbert Rollwage described the feeling in a letter that somehow survived the war. "We take off knowing we're outnumbered. We fight knowing that shooting down 2 or 3 bombers won't stop the rest. We land, if we land, knowing tomorrow will bring more of the same. The Americans lose more aircraft in a month than we produce in a year, and yet their formations grow larger, not smaller. How do you fight such an enemy?" It was a question with no good answer. The Luftwaffe tried various approaches, mass formations of fighters attacking bomber streams, specialized, heavy fighters with powerful cannons, ramming tactics, night fighting, new aircraft types like the Me-262 jet. Nothing changed the fundamental equation. America could produce aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them, and the disparity was accelerating. By spring 1944, the situation had reached crisis levels. American fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang with its long range, now escorted bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. Luftwaffe fighters faced not just bombers, but swarms of American fighters hunting them. Loss rates among German pilots soared. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, Germany's second highest scoring ace, survived the war but lost dozens of squadron mates. In interviews afterward, he was asked about American production. His response was telling me, "We knew the numbers. At some level, we understood what we faced, but accepting it meant accepting that the war was lost, so we didn't accept it. We kept flying, kept fighting, kept hoping that somehow things would change. They didn't." Summer 1944 brought Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies in 1940, could barely contest Allied air superiority. On D-Day, June 6th, the Allies flew over 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe flew fewer than 300. German pilots looked up and saw thousands of Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports, everything painted with invasion stripes. The sky was dark with them. Oberstleutnant Josef Priller led one of the few Luftwaffe attacks on the invasion beaches that day. He and his wingman, 2 fighters against thousands of Allied aircraft, made a single strafing pass and fled. Years later, he would describe it as the loneliest mission he ever flew. "We were spectators at our own defeat," he said. "Witnesses to what happens when industrial might decides the outcome of war." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The second half of 1944 was a nightmare for the Luftwaffe. American production reached its peak, nearly 100,000 aircraft for the year. German production, despite heroic efforts, managed only 40,000. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was quality. American pilots arrived in Europe with 250 hours of training. German pilots by late 1944 often had fewer than 100 hours. American aircraft received regular maintenance. German fighters were cannibalized for parts. American squadrons had fuel for training. German squadrons hoarded every liter for combat. The disparity showed in combat results. Loss ratios that had favored Germany in 1942 now heavily favored the Americans. Experienced German pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. New pilots, thrown into combat with inadequate training, died within their first handful of missions. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, who commanded various fighter wings throughout the war, watched his units disintegrate. "We're not being outfought," he reported. "We're being outnumbered, outproduced, and overwhelmed. Every advantage we once held has been neutralized by sheer industrial production. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe. By autumn 1944, German fighter strength had nominally recovered. Aircraft factories, dispersed to avoid bombing, were producing machines, but there wasn't enough fuel to fly them, enough trained pilots to man them, or enough ammunition for prolonged combat. Meanwhile, American bombers flew deep into Germany with near impunity. The breaking point came in multiple stages throughout late 1944 and early 1945. Oil production, hammered by Allied bombing, collapsed. Training programs shut down for lack of fuel. New fighters sat on airfields, unable to fly. Pilots who did take off often had barely enough fuel for one combat sortie before returning to base. Hauptmann Franz Stigler, the pilot we met at the beginning, flew his last combat mission in January 1945. By then, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. He would later describe what he saw in those final months: formations of American bombers so large they took 20 minutes to pass overhead, fighters in numbers that made interception suicide, a sky that belonged entirely to the enemy. But the most haunting memory wasn't the combat. It was the moment he finally saw an American airbase, photographed by reconnaissance aircraft. The image showed rows upon rows of brand new B-17s sitting on the tarmac, waiting to be flown to Europe. Hundreds of them, at a single base, and intelligence reports indicated dozens of such bases existed across America. That's when I knew the numbers were true, Stigler said, decades later. That's when I understood we had been fighting not just an air force, but an entire industrial system we could never hope to match. The realization came too late to matter. By February 1945, organized Luftwaffe resistance had effectively ceased. Individual pilots still flew, still fought, still died. But there was no coordinated defense, no strategic vision, no hope of turning the tide. The Americans and British flew wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted, destroying whatever targets they chose. The final accounting was devastating. In 1944 alone, America produced 96,000 aircraft, nearly 100,000 machines in a single year. That was more than Germany produced during the entire war from 1939 to 1945 combined. Let that sink in. 1 year of American production exceeded 6 years of German production. But raw numbers tell only part of the story. The real story is what those numbers represented: industrial capacity, trained workforce, logistical systems, resource allocation, strategic planning, all the invisible infrastructure that turns raw materials into combat power. Germany had built a military designed for short, decisive wars. America built a military designed to win through attrition, through production, through the patient application of overwhelming force. German pilots paid the price for their leadership's failure to understand this reality. Of the roughly 28,000 Luftwaffe pilots who served in fighter units during the war, approximately 15,000 were killed in action. Another 5,000 died in training accidents, many caused by inadequate instruction and fuel shortages. The survival rate for fighter pilots was among the lowest of any military specialty in any nation during the war. Major Gunther Roll survived, but barely. Shot down 8 times, he watched nearly his entire squadron die around him. In post-war interviews, he was consistently asked the same question: "And when did you know Germany would lose?" His answer never changed: "The first time I saw how many bombers the Americans could put in the sky at once. That was 1943. I knew then that we couldn't win. We simply didn't have the aircraft, the pilots, or the fuel to stop them." Roll was one of the lucky ones. He lived to tell his story. Most of his comrades didn't. The final months of the war saw Luftwaffe units reduced to desperation tactics. Operation Bodenplatte, launched on January 1, 1945, threw nearly 900 German fighters against Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. The attack achieved tactical surprise and destroyed several hundred Allied aircraft on the ground. It was also a strategic disaster. Germany lost over 200 fighters and, more importantly, over 200 experienced pilots. The Allies replaced their losses within a week. Germany never recovered. It was the Luftwaffe's last offensive action of the war. The lessons from this story echo through history. Technological sophistication means nothing without numbers. Individual skill cannot overcome systematic disadvantage. Ideology cannot replace reality. And perhaps most importantly, understanding your enemy's true capabilities is essential for survival. The German leadership's refusal to believe American production figures wasn't just a mistake. It was a catastrophic failure of intelligence, of strategic thinking, of basic rationality. They saw what they wanted to see, believed what they wanted to believe, and dismissed evidence that contradicted their worldview. The result was disaster. But there's another layer to this story, one that's often overlooked. The American production miracle didn't happen by accident. It required deliberate policy choices, massive investment, and the mobilization of an entire society. President Franklin Roosevelt set seemingly impossible goals. Industrialists like Henry Ford and William Knudsen figured out how to meet them. Millions of workers, many of them women who had never worked in factories before, made it happen. The famous Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. She was real. Her name was Rosalind Walter, among others, and she built aircraft at the Vought plant in Connecticut. She and millions like her transformed American society while transforming American industry. By 1944, women comprised 65% of the workforce in aircraft manufacturing. They weren't filling in, they were the workforce. This social mobilization had no equivalent in Germany. The Nazi ideology that dismissed Americans as weak and decadent also prevented Germany from fully mobilizing its own women into the workforce. German factories relied on forced labor from conquered territories, workers who had every incentive to sabotage production and none to excel. The contrast in productivity was stark. There's a painful irony here. The Nazi belief in German racial superiority, in the natural right of Germans to dominate others, prevented Germany from accessing the total mobilization that might have made victory possible. Meanwhile, American democracy, dismissed by Nazi propaganda as weak and chaotic, proved capable of coordination and sacrifice on a scale the totalitarian Reich never achieved. The numbers bear this out. American aircraft production in 1944 wasn't just 3 times German production. It was 3 times German production, while also producing the ships, tanks, trucks, and weapons in quantities Germany couldn't match. American factories supplied not just American forces, but British, Soviet, French, and other Allied forces through Lend-Lease. The arsenal of democracy didn't just outproduce the Axis. It outproduced the Axis while simultaneously supplying half the world. German pilots learned this lesson in the sky, one combat mission at a time. Each sortie brought fresh evidence of American abundance, fresh fighters, fresh crews, fresh tactics, and always, always more aircraft than the day before. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke's diary entries chart this realization in real time. In early 1943, he writes confidently about shooting down American bombers. By mid-year, his tone shifts. He notes the growing numbers, the improving tactics, the lengthening range of American fighters. By 1944, his entries read like someone watching an avalanche approach, knowing escape is impossible, but unable to stop watching. His final entry, written days before the war's end, is haunting in its simplicity. They won, not through better pilots or better aircraft, though by the end they had both. They won through production. We were fighting numbers we couldn't comprehend and couldn't match. We fought bravely. We lost inevitably. The strategic implications extend beyond World War II. The conflict established a pattern that would dominate military thinking for decades. Industrial capacity determines military capacity. The Cold War was, in many ways, an extension of this principle. Both superpowers invested heavily in production capacity, in reserve stocks, in the ability to surge production during crisis. The lesson was clear. Wars between industrial powers are won in factories as much as battlefields. Germany learned this too late. America understood it from the beginning. Yet we must be careful not to oversimplify. American production wasn't inevitable. It required specific decisions, specific investments, specific organizational structures. The British, despite similar democratic institutions and industrial experience, never achieved American production levels. The Soviets, despite massive industrial investment, built fewer aircraft despite larger pools of labor. What made America different was a unique combination of factors: vast natural resources, geographic security that allowed concentration on production rather than defense, a large population of educated workers, an entrepreneurial culture that rewarded innovation, political leadership willing to set ambitious goals and provide resources to achieve them, and, perhaps most critically, an automotive industry that could be rapidly converted to aircraft production. Henry Ford's Willow Run facility exemplified this advantage. At peak production, it turned out one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, not every 63 hours. Every 63 minutes, a 4-engine heavy bomber weighing 60,000 pounds fully loaded with a wingspan of 110 feet, assembled in just over an hour. German intelligence officers who learned of this considered it propaganda. Impossible, they reported. No factory could maintain such pace. But Willow Run wasn't alone. Douglas's plant in Long Beach produced similar numbers. Consolidated's facility in San Diego matched them. Across America, aircraft rolled off production lines at rates that defied German comprehension. The secret wasn't mystical. It was methodical. American engineers broke aircraft assembly into thousands of discrete steps. Each step was simple enough that workers with minimal training could perform it reliably. Quality control was rigorous, ensuring that standardization didn't compromise performance. The result was aircraft that were well-built, reliable, and produced in staggering numbers. This approach required accepting certain trade-offs. American aircraft designs prioritized production efficiency. They used more aluminum, which was easier to work with than the steel-aluminum composites Germany favored. They standardized components across different aircraft types, reducing the variety of parts factories needed to produce. They accepted slightly lower performance in exchange for much higher reliability and easier maintenance. These trade-offs proved wise. A German fighter might have a slight speed advantage in optimal conditions, but American fighters flew more missions because they spent less time in maintenance. They had better availability because spare parts were abundant, and there were many, many more of them. By late 1944, this disparity had become overwhelming. The Luftwaffe operated roughly 3,000 fighters in the West. American and British forces had over 10,000. The numerical superiority extended to every category: bombers, transports, reconnaissance aircraft, trainers. In every measure that mattered, the Allies had more. But numbers alone don't tell the complete story. We need to understand what those numbers meant in human terms. For German pilots, it meant flying multiple missions per day, every day, until you were killed or too badly wounded to continue. It meant watching friends die, squadrons decimated, replacement pilots arriving with barely enough training to take off and land. It meant the growing certainty that you were fighting a war already lost. For American pilots, it meant something different. It meant knowing that if you were shot down, a rescue aircraft would look for you. It meant that if your aircraft was damaged, a replacement would be available. It meant that the massive logistics system behind you would keep you supplied, fed, and equipped. It meant fighting from a position of strength. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. Combat is terrifying under any circumstances, but fighting from weakness, knowing you're outnumbered and outproduced, adds a layer of despair that no amount of courage can overcome. Lieutenant Walter Schuck, who survived the war with nearly 200 victories, described this feeling. By 1945, we flew not to win, but to delay the inevitable. We knew we couldn't stop the bombers. We hoped only to make their victory more expensive, more painful. It was fighting without hope, and that's the hardest fighting of all. The end came in stages. First, the Luftwaffe lost control of the skies over Germany itself. Then it lost the ability to contest Allied operations over occupied territory. Finally, it lost even the ability to mount meaningful resistance. By April 1945, Allied aircraft flew over Berlin with impunity. The city that Hitler had promised would never be bombed lay in ruins, victim of thousands of tons of high explosives delivered by aircraft Germany couldn't stop. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Above his head, American and Soviet aircraft circled freely. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war as the most powerful air force in the world, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The final accounting was brutal. Germany produced approximately 113,000 aircraft between 1939 and 1945. America produced approximately 300,000 aircraft between 1941 and 1945. In 4 years, America built nearly 3 times what Germany built in 6, and American aircraft were, on average, larger, more complex, and more capable. But these numbers, staggering as they are, still don't capture the full picture. We need to add British production, approximately 125,000 aircraft. Soviet production, approximately 160,000 aircraft. The Allies collectively produced approximately 585,000 aircraft during the war. The Axis powers, including Germany, Japan, and Italy, produced approximately 228,000. The Allies built more than twice as many aircraft. They didn't win through slight advantage. They won through overwhelming, crushing industrial superiority. German pilots couldn't believe the numbers because the numbers seemed to violate everything they had been taught about production, about warfare, about reality itself. But the numbers were true, every single one of them, and those numbers ultimately decided the war. The lessons resonate today. Modern military planning still emphasizes industrial capacity, the ability to produce, to replace losses, to sustain operations over extended periods, remains fundamental to military power. Technological sophistication matters, but so does quantity. The best weapon is worthless if you can't produce enough of them. There's also a deeper lesson about the danger of ideological thinking. The Nazi leadership's belief in their own superiority, in American weakness, in the natural order of racial hierarchies, prevented them from accurately assessing their enemy. They saw what ideology told them to see, not what evidence showed them. This cognitive failure proved fatal. In war, as in life, reality has a way of asserting itself. You can deny inconvenient facts, dismiss contrary evidence, believe what you want to believe. But reality doesn't care about your beliefs. Sooner or later, it will present you with consequences you cannot ignore. For German fighter pilots in 1943 and 1944, reality presented itself in the form of endless streams of American bombers. They could shoot down dozens, and hundreds more would appear. They could fight with skill and courage and still be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They could refuse to believe American production figures and still die beneath waves of aircraft those figures represented. The title of our story asked what German pilots couldn't believe: that America was producing 50,000 planes per year. The reality was worse. By 1944, America was producing nearly 100,000. And that production, that overwhelming industrial might, broke the Luftwaffe as surely as any battle. Franz Stigler, the pilot we met at the beginning, survived the war. He emigrated to Canada, became a successful businessman, and lived until 2008. In his later years, he gave many interviews about his wartime experiences. One question came up repeatedly: how did German pilots cope with the knowledge they were fighting a war they couldn't win? His answer was always the same: we didn't accept it. Even when the evidence was overwhelming, even when American aircraft filled the sky horizon to horizon, we told ourselves it was temporary. That new weapons would change everything, that somehow victory was still possible, because accepting the truth meant accepting that thousands of our comrades had died for nothing, that we were dying for nothing. And that's not something the human mind wants to accept. But truth doesn't require acceptance to remain true. American production in 1944 was 96,000 aircraft. In 1943, it was 85,000. These aren't estimates or propaganda. They're documented, verified, historical facts. German pilots couldn't believe them, but they were real nonetheless. And in the end, that made all the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.